So I'm Sophia Greska, and I direct the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. And I am extremely excited to introduce Nancy Krieger, who I think you all realize is an absolute rock star in the world that we are all a part of and the work that we all do. Nancy is a professor of social epidemiology in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at what's now called the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and she solely directs the HSPH Interdisciplinary Concentration on Women, Gender, and Health. She is renowned for her incredible work as a social epidemiologist, and she's got nearly 3 decades of experiences focusing on the interconnections between social justice and public health concerns. And I think one of the things to talk about is some of her writings. Most recently, this book that she has out, Epidemiology and the People's Health, Theory and Context. I mean, it's a must-read for anybody who has not read it so far. And I hope that everybody recognizes that in terms of interest in health and justice issues, it really is at the forefront of helping us to think more creatively about things, but also in terms of how to act. I think that one of the things about Nancy that is always exciting is not just the things that she says that we listen to, but the things she makes us think about. And so I really look forward to this talk and the conversation that we all are going to have. And with that, Professor Nancy Krieger, the floor is yours.
So before beginning, I'd like to thank Sophia and to be very clear to people that interdisciplinary concentration on women, gender, and health is something that we worked on and conceived together and co-directed for many years. And that anything that I present here that has anything to do with notions of human rights, I've learned from Sophia, but she has no responsibility for my errors. Okay, well, good afternoon. And I'm really delighted to be speaking today to you on the topic of structural racism and the people's health. History and context matters. Per a practice that I now follow for all my presentations, I start by acknowledging that I'm on an indigenous land, and I offer respects both to the indigenous holders of these lands and to knowledge informed by critical indigenous perspectives. So I'll start with a brief reminder as to our current context, introduce the EcoSocial Theory of disease distribution, which guides my work, and after that I'm going to offer several empirical examples of my research on structural racism and health inequities in relation specifically to Jim Crow and both past and present residential segregation, and I'll conclude with some thoughts on embodied histories, health inequities, and the people's health. But first, a brief reminder as to why one studies the relationship between injustice and health. It's not to prove that injustice is wrong, because injustice is wrong by definition. Rather, it concerns counting for accountability. As I've written previously, the rationale for studying discrimination in health, like that for studying any societal determinant of health, is to render an accounting of who and what drives population patterns of health and health inequities, and to generate knowledge useful for guiding policies and actions to prevent and rectify harm and advance health equity. This slide shows all too familiar data which critically situate our work. We live in a world of growing social spatial polarization, with ever greater concentrations of private wealth, as epitomized by the factoid that in 2018, 26 persons in the world own as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity, down from 43 in 2017. In the US, where the top 1% owns a far greater share of wealth than their 1% counterparts in various European countries, 3 men now own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the US population. Enormous wealth gaps by race ethnicity are on the rise, and intergenerational economic mobility is on the skids. The maps at the top of the slide show countries scaled to the metric displayed. Notably, countries bloated with billionaires and military spending dwindled to the merest threads for such outcomes as infant deaths, no water access, and no basic sanitation, for which the enormous continent of Africa and the Indian subcontinent loom large. Add to this our planetary context of the full-on climate emergency is brought about by profit-driven, consumptogenic economies fueled by fossil fuel. With the last 4 years having the hottest air temperatures and ocean temperature on record, and environmental pollution, contamination, and degradation especially prevalent in those countries least responsible for carbon dioxide emissions. The implications are devastating for people and the myriad other species with whom we interdependently share this planet. At the same time, we are alive to the stunning and sensuous beauty of this world, with the slide showing various new UNESCO sites, assorted prize-winning photos, depictions of the creations and bonds that people have generatively and constructively brought into being and forged from time immemorial to now. Affirming such awareness, younger generations worldwide are now leading the fight for a more equitable and sustainable world, as illustrated by these photos from around the world from the September 2019 global climate strike. The existence of these connections between people, politics, ecologies, and health was very much on my mind when I first formally introduced the EcoSocial Theory of disease distribution back in 1994. The spark was my frustration with the narrow, individualistic, ahistorical, and highly biomedical bent of my field. Noting that arguments can be an especially productive spur for critical thinking, I was at a journal club at a meeting at my first job after I graduated, and the proverbial quote-unquote web of causation was once again invoked to explain connections between so-called risk factors. I pointedly asked, who is the spider who has made such a pernicious web with such unjust distributions? And that led to my 1994 essay, Epidemiology and the Web of Causation. Has anyone seen the spider? And hence also the EcoSocial Theory of disease distribution. Etymologically, the word theory is derived from the Greek word theoria, whose original meaning of looking at in relation to theater and spectacle, transmuted to schema, and thus inner vision. In the case of science, theory refers to a coherent and presumptively testable set of interrelated ideas that enable independent scientists to discover, describe, explain, and predict features of a commonly shared biophysical reality in which cause and effect exists. Like all such theories, like all such thinking, theories inevitably rely on metaphor to enable the unknown to be conceptualized in relation to the known, which is vital, given that in our world, indeed universe, is way more wonderful, unruly, and stranger than anything that we could ever imagine. The point being that if a spiderless web of causation didn't cut it for me, what would? And what I came up with that led to rich theorizing about the idea of embodiment was a fractal image that metaphorically and materially united the bush of evolution with the scaffolding of society that different social groups seek daily to reinforce or alter. As I wrote then, the intertwining ensemble must be understood to exist at every level, subcellular to societal, repeating indefinitely like a fractal object. Different epidemiologic profiles at the population level would accordingly be seen as reflecting the interlinked and diverse patterns of exposure and susceptibility that are brought into play by the dynamic intertwining of these changing forms. It is an image that does not permit the cleavage of the social from the biologic and the biologic from the social. It is an image that does not obscure agency, and it is an image that embraces history rather than hides it from view. This image makes clear that although the biologic may set the basis for the existence of humans and hence our social life, it is the social life that sets the path along which the biologic may flourish or wilt, end quote. This slide shows key connected features of the EcoSocial Theory of disease distribution, whose primary objective is to explain population distribution of health, which is a phrase that appears clearly at the center of the figure. And here I note you have a handout that gives the references for everything that I'm citing in this talk, including many citations around EcoSocial theory, so don't worry about that part. You can follow up and look more if it's of interest to you. Let me quickly review here some key ideas, and the rest of the presentation will bring these ideas to life. First, note that EcoSocial theory explicitly is concerned with levels, pathways, and power, and mandates thinking about these phenomena in relation to each and every construct and phenomenon under study. Second, note that the levels are conceptualized in relation to both societal and ecosystem levels, since after all, life and health and disease existed on this planet long before humans came onto the scene, even as we as a species have considerably changed the terms of life for all. Note also that processes occurring within and also connecting levels pertain to production, exchange, consumption, and reproduction. Third, note how time is included in relation to both life course and also historical context and generation. Note also how inequitable social relations, in particular involving racism, class, and gender and sexuality, are positioned as both connected and key to shaping population distributions of health. Embodiment, in turn, is one of the four core and conjoined constructs that appears in the upper right-hand corner which together shape population health distributions via processes tied to the specific political economy and political ecology at issue. Understanding how embodiment occurs, that is, how we literally incorporate biologically our societal and ecological context, requires grappling with entangled social and biophysical pathways of embodiment, which is the second core construct. It also requires considering the third core construct, the cumulative interplay of exposure, susceptibility, and resistance at each and every level in relation to time and history. One implication is that social movements resisting injustice and organizing for equity are every much as part of the resistance relevant to shaping population health profiles as our individual level interactions or resilience. Joy and dignity count, not just suffering and pain. The fourth construct, agency and accountability, in turn refers to both to who and what at each and every level is responsible for health inequities and also for the research to explain population health. At issue is identifying who benefits from injustice and from research which ignores injustice, and conversely, who is harmed by injustice and by the overt suppression, lack of funding, and self-censorship that can limit research on these issues. Two key corollaries to the ecosocial construct of embodiment are the need to reject biological essentialism and instead to embrace embodied integration. In this increasingly omic, nanoscale-centric, and hyperbiomedical research moment, it is critical to emphasize that the drivers of current and changing societal patterns of disease distribution, including health inequities, are exogenous to people's bodies and reside instead in the body politic. Nor can explanations of disease distribution be reduced solely to explanations of disease mechanisms, because the latter do not account for why rates and population patterns of disease change in complex ways over time and place. It is also essential to distinguish between what I refer to as biologic expressions of injustice versus unjust interpretations of biology. The first of these refers to the embodied consequences of adverse exposures to class injustice, racism, sexism, heterosexism, gender binarism, etc., and in effect constitute the embodied phenotypes by which injustice is biologically expressed. The second of these refers to how injustice can distort understandings of biology, as occurs when social group differences in health are presumed to arise a priori from innate biology. For example, when race rather than racism is seen as a cause of racial ethnic inequities in health. Imagine starting instead with the premise of shared humanity and also dignity. The fundamental point is that we, like any living creatures, live embodied, constantly integrating our experiences and exposures for good and for bad. And in the case of our social being, embodiment means that we are not a member of a particular racial ethnic group one day, have a particular gender identity on another, still another day have a particular sexual orientation. We are all of these at once, and the same holds for our social class, nationality, immigration status, where we live and work. Or as Claudia Rankine, an African-American poet, recently said in her award-winning prose poem, Citizen, an American Lyric, quote, "The world is wrong. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. It's turned your flesh into its own cupboard. Not everything remembered is useful, but it all comes from the world to be stored in you," end quote. The image from the New Zealand Māori presentation on historical intergenerational trauma tells a similar story, literally rooted in settler colonialism and racism, with a trunk containing the political and social mechanisms at play, and the branches and leaves expressing the resultant adverse outcomes, including but not limited to health status. Roots are also key to endurance and growth, and new Indigenous and African American histories and activism emphasize renewal, continued resistance, resilience, and strength in the face of daunting odds, drawing on history through the roots to advocate for a more equitable and sustainable world. The notion that biology is expressed in societal and ecological context, is sensuous, and is shaped by history is core to the analysis of biology, development, and evolution for all species. We are always and inseparably social beings and biological organisms, inhabited, being shaped by, and shaping a world in which entwined histories of ecologies and genealogies are inherently brought together by social systems, as shown in this figure prepared by Niles Eldredge, an evolutionary biologist and paleontologist, and Marjorie Green, who was a major 20th century philosopher of biology. Emphasizing the centrality of embodiment, Green stated, quote, "Persons are human organisms, but personalized. They have subjective experience, but they are animals, subjectively experiencing animals, yet are surely embodied as any other animals. And like all animals, they are also physical systems as well. But they achieve the personalization of their bodily and physical nature through participation in a culture. In other words, to be a person is an achievement of a human organism mediated by participation in a culture. Or to put it still another way, a developed human being is at one and the same time a personalization of nature and an embodiment of culture. And of course, people not only embody but can also change their cultures and societies more broadly. Consider only the case of abolition of slavery, the enfranchisement of women, the growing number of countries with same-sex marriages, even as 72 as of 2017 of national laws still prohibiting same-sex relationships. This embodied stance, which rejects determinism and embraces historical contingency, challenges the dominant view expressed by this figure to the right, the quincux, which was designed in 1889 by Sir Francis Galton, who famously coined the term eugenics, and who also invented the correlation coefficient in his quest to prove that population distributions, including of intelligence, were a product of heredity, not environment. Seeking to explain population distributions, Galton designed his quincux so that identical pellets poured through a funnel that randomly bounced off carefully placed pins would fall into different bins and produce a normal distribution, with the height of the column reflecting the probability of different pathways of descent. To Galton, the device demonstrated the properties of what he called the law of frequency of error, a law that he claimed, quote, would have been personified by the Greeks and deified if they had known of it. Each element, as it is sorted into place, finds, as it were, a preordained niche accurately adapted to fit it, end quote. Now consider the alternative mechanical device shown on the left. It was built by several late 20th century physicists who altered the shape of the funnel and pins in order to generate a log normal curve, that is, the one where the logarithm of the values has a normal distribution. Illustrating the interplay of structure and chance, it thus offers an illuminating mechanical metaphor for showing how altered structures can change population distributions, including of identical individuals, and do so by affecting the underlying probabilities of events randomly occurring to those populations' individuals. In other words, change the shape of the funnel, change the location of the pins, you get a completely different distribution with the identical pellets. They're not just going into a preordained niche, they're going into the niche by those probabilities of what was designed by the structure. This means, and it's also got quirks because it's stochastic, so it doesn't tell you which bin it's going to go in, but it gives you the probability distribution. This means that the observed embodied differences between populations are simply that, observed differences in a given context, not clear-cut indicators of innate difference. Structured chance allows us to see this possibility more clearly, and this structuring plays out over time and different spatial scales as well. In sum, we live socially, spatially, and temporally structured multi-level realities. History and context always matter. How could they not? Or as I wrote when reflecting on being at the first People's Climate March in 2014, indeed, the real ecological fallacy is to think epidemiologists or others could ever understand the people's health except in societal and ecological and hence historical context. An ecosocial understanding of embodying history thus entails conceptualizing health outcomes, whether biomarkers or diseases, as being historically contingent, emergent, embodied phenotypes, whose emergence reflects four types of history: societal, individual life course, pathological cellular, and evolutionary. So I'm now going to offer you some empirical examples to illustrate these ideas. I'll focus primarily on the centuries-long problem of US racism and health as analyzed via the lens of ecosocial theory. Underscoring the urgency of this focus is rising overt expressions of white supremacy and ethno-nationalism, all premised on false views of human biology, fear-mongering, and hate. In all cases, relevant pathways of embodiment include economic deprivation, exogenous hazards, social trauma, targeted marketing of harmful commodities, inadequate or degrading medical care, and degradation of ecosystems. And again, the point of such research is not to prove that racism or injustice more broadly are bad, because they are by definition. It is to understand and prevent its adverse health impacts, and also spark imagination and action to bring about health equity. As an aid to empirical analysis of embodying injustice, this slide shows a schema that I've newly developed regarding the different types of measures of injustice relevant to population health science research, with these metrics spanning from structural to individual to internalized. Given the welter of what are nowadays being called quote-unquote structural measures, I find it helpful to distinguish between three types of metrics. First, those that refer to the overt rules of the game that institute injustice, such as legal racial discrimination. Second, the non-explicit rules of the game that adversely discriminate without explicitly naming the target of discrimination. For example, including racialized voter suppression by restricting types of ID or hours or locations of voting, but without ever naming race as a criterion. And third, there are the area-based or institutional indicators of injustice, which are the most commonly used type and typically comprise measures of differences in social outcomes such as occupations, education, income, incarceration, political representation, etc., across the privileged versus targeted groups, and also sometimes employ survey data on beliefs and practices involving adverse discrimination, sometimes audit data, but never actually have information on the actual rules of the game that have structured the injustice, that have placed the funnel and the pins. Individual level metrics include self-report data and implicit measures regarding both exposures and internalized beliefs, and also manipulation experimentally of adverse exposures. In all cases, the comparison group matters both socially and temporally. For example, one can compare within a given polity with the before versus after passage of explicit rules enforcing or banning discrimination in relation to health, and do that for the targeted group, or look at the magnitude of health inequities between the targeted and privileged groups. You can also do cross-sectional longitudinal comparisons across polities that have different explicit rules. And in all cases, the research must take into account etiologic period for potential lag effects and rather large assumptions about quote-unquote holding all else constant. In my talk today, I'm going to focus on structural racism, in part because of its importance and in part as a corrective to the contemporary literature on racial discrimination in health, which overwhelmingly focuses on individual levels of exposure. And I choose two types of outcomes to encompass the life course, specifically birth outcomes and cancer. I'll start by underscoring the long reach of historical injustice, both for its continued embodied health impacts and also how it shapes contemporary exposures that continue to harm health. Consider first the health impact of Jim Crow and its abolition in the mid-1960s. By way of background, a century earlier, the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War, which ended in 1865, instituted the first real period of progress in racial equality and civil rights in the U.S. Not surprisingly, the backlash was severe, and with complicity of the federal government by the 1880s, the white power elite entrenched the invidious system of Jim Crow, which became the law of the land in 21 U.S. states, plus the District of Columbia, accompanied also by de facto discrimination in the remaining 29 states. In essence, Jim Crow was a form of structural, legal, racial discrimination, backed by the state and upheld by violence and terror. Directed chiefly against Black Americans, but also encompassing other racial ethnic groups legally defined as quote-unquote not white, for example, American Indians and Asian Americans. Jim Crow laws imposed legal restrictions for Black and other quote-unquote non-white persons and created legal privileges for white persons in such domains as education, transportation, hospital and penal institutions, welfare institutions, employment, marriage, public accommodation, other public venues, and of course, voting, all of which are major determinants of population health and health inequities. These laws were so numerous that they filled 524 pages in small print in the path-breaking text, States' Laws on Race and Color, the first comprehensive compilation of state and local ordinances, which was published in 1950 by Paula Murray. This slide shows Jim Crow in action in relation to public accommodations, public transportation, and water fountains. For any of you who may think Jim Crow is ancient history, do the math. Look at this table, which considers 7 different birth cohorts, and ask how old their members were in 1965, how old they are now, and whether their parents were likely born before 1965, or whether they themselves became a parent before 1965. Ask yourself if you were alive, how old you were in 1965, or your parents, or your grandparents. These questions are equally salient for other types of historical justice in any country context. The key point is that Jim Crow's abolition was only 55 years ago, which is a mere instant when considered in relation to historical generations. Any US-born person aged 55 or older, which includes me, was born when Jim Crow was the law of the land, combined with the other de facto discrimination. Anyone aged 70 and older now, the age group in which most US mortality occurs, was at least 20, and perhaps had their first child when Jim Crow was legal. Think life course. We are reckoning with embodied history within and across generations. It is thus all the more shocking that when I first started exploring work on contemporary health effects of Jim Crow a few years ago, I learned that the number of such studies could literally be counted on one hand. This surprised me for two reasons. First, Jim Crow can plausibly be hypothesized to be a major social determinant of health, given how its legally codified system of white supremacy, bolstered by extrajudicial terror, structured exposure of Black Americans to noxious conditions, and second, its abolition was not that long ago, again, in living memory, embodied. On that note, here is a visual depiction of the results of our first study, which looked at infant death rates, and our findings make even more shocking the lack of research in this topic, given that the number of persons affected is large. Specifically, as shown on this slide, 2/3 of all Black infants born in 1960 to 64 were born in those 21 Jim Crow states plus DC, and they are now in their 50s. Again, this is living history, alive within us, not the ancient past. This slide shows the descriptive results for the infant deaths for the US Black and white populations in the Jim Crow and non-Jim Crow states. Our graph includes data for not only from the computerized US mortality records, which commenced in 1969, which are the black lines, but also US state-level vital statistics that we hand-tabulated for 1940, 50, and 60, which are the gray lines. What appears is a singular convergence in the US Black infant death rates for the Jim Crow versus non-Jim Crow polities that occurred between 1965 and the early 1970s, a finding corroborated by the results of our sophisticated statistical analysis. Our analysis of premature mortality, death before age 65, reveals similar trends. Remember, 65 is when Jim Crow was legally abolished, with the other civil rights acts coming in 1968 and 69. In other work, we've newly shown in the first ever studies to look at Jim Crow and cancer that among contemporary US women diagnosed with breast cancer, most of whom are in their 60s and older, that Jim Crow birthplace is associated among US Black women with breast cancer lethality by increasing the risk of being diagnosed with estrogen receptor negative tumors, ER negative. Before interpreting the results shown in this slide, let me offer some background. First, ER status matters because ER negative tumors are more lethal than ER positive tumors. This is because they can't be treated with anti-hormonal medications that can be used against ER-positive tumors. Of note, the US literature is full of studies which suggest that the greater likelihood of being diagnosed with an ER-negative tumor among US Black compared to white women is due to quote-unquote race, conceptualized as a biological characteristic, with these studies paying scant to no regard to any of the societal determinants of ER status. Our first study, then, used data from the USC IIGH registry group. We focused on all US-born Black and white women aged 25 to 84 diagnosis who were diagnosed with primary invasive breast cancer between 1992 and 2012. Our key finding was that risk of having an ER-negative tumor was greater among the US Black women born in a Jim Crow versus non-Jim Crow state for those who were born before 1965, and no such Jim Crow effect was evident among the white women. Notably, other new research, for example in China, has found that women born during the famine that occurred there in the late 1950s also have increased risk of ER-negative tumors. These studies suggest that biological pathways involving extreme adversity experienced while in utero may be relevant to ER-negative status tumors later in life. In our second study, whose results I show here, we considered the problem from the standpoint of biological generations and asked what was the pace of change in the percent of ER-positive cases diagnosed among women in this group. And we used a measure from evolutionary biology called the Haldane, which measures the pace of change in phenotypic standard deviations per generation. Our findings: First, that the percent of ER-positive cases rose by birth cohort, starting in 1915 to 19, up to 1975 to 79, and they did so only for the women diagnosed before age 55. Second, changes by biological graduation were far greater for black versus white women, and among the black women were far greatest for those born in the Jim Crow versus the non-Jim Crow states. And third, among women under age 55, the implication was that it was to close the black-white gap in ER-positive tumors by 1/2. Such rapid phenotypic change can plausibly be driven only by factors exogenous to populations' genomes, and this is despite the emphasis in the literature on genetic contributions to black versus white risks of ER-negative tumors, especially at younger ages. By contrast, among women aged 55 and older at diagnosis, no trend was evident among the black women, and the percent of ER-positive tumors actually declined slightly among the white women, which is likely due to drops in hormone therapy, which is another story entirely. The larger implication is that Jim Crow continues to cast a long shadow on current populations of patterns of population health. Embodiment is real and persistent. Another boot of Jim Crow remains in the current patterns of local residential segregation, which in turn affects people's present-day health. Spatial segregation matters. It's important to remember that we don't simply live in unjust societies. We live in places, and no matter how much of our lives or livelihoods may roam around in cyberspace or be engaged with non-geographically defined communities of interest or groups of one sort or another, issues of residence, economics, power, and health are tightly bound, as is the intergenerational inheritance of property and privilege or lack thereof. Consider, for example, recent research showing that the current spatial patterns of racialized impoverishment in Jim Crow states are associated with earlier spatial distributions of enslavement and greater severity of Jim Crow regimes. Over the past few years, I found myself wondering if there was more that we in public health could do to discern the public health ramifications of growing extreme concentrations of income and wealth, to bring into view those who benefit from a status quo in which working families are below the poverty line while the proverbial middle is hollowed out. At issue is residential economic segregation, which in the US is heavily racialized. The value of using measures of segregation is because they capture and portray inequity as a social relationship, because segregation by definition involves two or more social groups. One cannot focus, say, solely on impoverished persons. Instead, in any such measure, affluent persons are part of the picture as well. However, upon delving deeper into the public health and social science literature, I confronted two problems. First, the work seemed to focus primarily on racial segregation, often controlling for socioeconomic position, or less commonly, it's looked at economic segregation, often not taking into account race ethnicity. And the two phenomena were not studied together, in part because technically these two types of segregation typically cannot be put in the same model given their high, albeit not total, correlation. Secondly, I found that most studies measured segregation at the city level or higher, precisely because spatial social polarization within cities means that most conventional measures cannot be used for smaller areas. For example, the Gini index of income inequality is the same for a neighborhood where everyone is impoverished and where everyone is affluent. And the same problem affects the main measure used for racial segregation, which is the index of dissimilarity. Third, although I did find some newer measures of local segregation, all continue to cleave racial and economic segregation, and they're problematically conceptualized and operationalized as relative measures. And just to be clear, what you have to do, for example, for the index of dissimilarity is you say, here's the overall distribution of the population in a city. How much would I have to move people between areas to come to a more even distribution? But you can't do that for a small area because you need to have the smaller units, and that doesn't relate then to the big pattern of segregation in the city as a whole. So rummaging around the social science literature, I came across an intriguing measure developed in 2001 by Douglas Massey, one of the leading US scholars on racial segregation. He termed his metric the Index of Concentration at the Extremes, or ICE, which I grant in the US is now an unfortunate acronym. And he designed it to be a measure of spatial social polarization, one that could be computed at multiple levels and scales of geography, ranging from -1 to 1, and calculated by the provocative and deceptively simple formula shown in this slide. The ICE uniquely captures in a single metric the extent to which an area's population is or is not concentrated at one or the other end of the spectrum of privilege and deprivation. It's, for example, it's the number of people in the top category minus the bottom category divided by the total population. If everybody is in the top category, it's 1. If everybody's in the bottom category, it's a -1. And then you can get values in between. But you're looking at the extremes of the distribution, however defined, in relation to income, in relation to race, ethnicity, or any other contrast you want between targeted and privileged group. To date, the ICE has mainly been used in social science studies, just in a handful of health studies, and computed solely in relation to economic measures. Our novel contribution has been to extend use of the ICE to measure not racial segregation and also racialized economic segregation, and to do so in a multi-level framework. No such joint measures of racialized economic segregation had previously been used in the social science or population health literature. So I'll now share with you results from several of my new projects in Boston, New York City, and Massachusetts overall to explore whether the ICE might have value as a metric for monitoring and analyzing health inequities. The objective is to bring back onto the map, literally and politically, the societal relationships that underlie the health inequities that we see. We first introduced our new ICE measure in a study that we published in 2014, which we conducted in the greater Boston area, for which we focus on area-based exposure, air pollution. We have subsequently examined a wide range of outcomes from infant mortality to premature mortality, cancer incidence and stage of diagnosis, and weapons-related fatal and non-fatal assaults. In virtually all cases, the ICE for racialized economic segregation detected the strongest gradients compared to ICE measures that used only race, ethnicity, or only income, and also detected stronger gradients compared to the poverty level. In our newer work, taking advantage of being able to compute the ICE meaningfully at both the census tract and city-town level, we've begun exploring its joint use at both levels, which no one has done before. Illustrative of our findings are the results shown here for child mortality, which is death before age 5, for which the ICE for racialized economic segregation detected the largest health inequities. So that's looking at the ICE for income in the top row, then the ICE only for race, ethnicity, then the ICE for racialized economic segregation, second row from the bottom. The last row is for poverty. Secondly, steeper gradients occurred in single-level models at the census tract, which is the first column, compared to the city level, which is the second column. And finally, in the multi-level models, which are the third and fourth column, which included both city and census tract, the effects remained far stronger for the census tracts and were greatly attenuated at the city level. These models included random effect at the county and city-town levels, plus also adjusted for relevant covariates. We found similar patterns for fatal and non-fatal assaults, police killings, and also infant mortality, child mortality, premature mortality, cause-specific mortality for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer overall and specific cancer sites, and also deaths due to smoking and all non-smoking related deaths, as well as cancer incidence. Now, the finding of greater sensitivity to inequities at the census tract compared to the city-town level is not surprising. It's what we would expect, given reduction in variation caused by aggregating to higher geographic levels. Similarly, our finding that racialized economic segregation packs a stronger punch than solely racial segregation should also not be surprising. But again, I note that ours is the first study to use this type of measure. The twofold implications which are disturbing are that first, prior research relying on solely city-level measures of segregation has likely underestimated the impact of spatial social polarization on health. And secondly, census tract ICE measures may be a useful addition to public health monitoring toolkit to track how growing spatial social polarization, a global phenomenon expressing rising extreme concentrations of privilege and deprivation, are becoming embodied as health inequities. Taking these work with these ICE measures one step further is new research we've just started, linking these indicators to their structural rules of the game origins. 2 years ago, key federally sponsored maps dating back to the 1930s and only rediscovered in the U.S. National Archives in the 1980s were newly digitized and made available on the web for over 150 cities. Together, these maps show the profound role of the U.S. government in nationally structuring and imposing racial segregation, including patterns of both divestment and disinvestment and investment. In brief, to encourage mortgage lending and home building during the Great Depression, in 1933, Congress created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, to protect homeowners from foreclosures by refinancing their loans. And in 1934, it established the Federal Housing Administration to ensure mortgages and encourage banks to make long-term loans with high loan-to-value ratios and fixed monthly payments. Both agencies sought to protect what they deemed to be a, quote, desirable neighborhood character, end quote, which they equated with being white and affluent. To do so, they developed a four-tiered underwriting system that systematically undervalued racially mixed neighborhoods and strongly discouraged lending in neighborhoods that were either integrated or populated primarily by residents of color, while favoring neighborhoods that were white and affluent. The four-color schema was one where best equals green, still desirable equals blue, definitely declining equals yellow, and hazardous equals red, gave rise to the term redlining to denote the boundaries of neighborhoods deemed credit unworthy by Holk because of their racial ethnic composition. If you lived in such a neighborhood, regardless of your own economic standing, you could not get a mortgage. As you can see for this map from 1936 for Seattle, justification for the red coloring of area D4 simply stated, quote, this is the Negro area of Seattle. You can go to Mapping Inequality, this website, and see the notes for all the different neighborhoods and the way that they're described. There is language, one of the key categories is saying who's infiltrating, that is the language used in the Rater's Guide, who is infiltrating the neighborhood with many objectionable statements, at least objectionable to me now, about the Negroes, about the immigrants, about the Irish, about the Jews, about the Italians, about the Asians, about you name it other than white. It's very explicit language. These were guided and used consistently across the entire country. Social science research has shown that redlining has had long-lasting implications for neighborhood development and disinvestment, and also intergenerational transmissions of wealth or lack thereof. So far, however, only 6 published U.S. studies have examined the relevance of historical redlining to contemporary health, all published in the last year, 2 in the last 3 weeks. These studies focus on violence, self-reported health, tuberculosis, alcohol outlet clusters, urban heat islands, and then also asthma admissions for ER for children. And they all have found provocative associations with Holt grades, independent of and in conjunction with current neighborhood conditions. These findings are relevant not only to public health, but also to urgent policy debates about fair housing and reparations. So here are some of the results of our new work, analyzing current cancer stage at diagnosis using data from the Massachusetts Cancer Registry in relation to both Holk measures and current census tract ICE measures. We selected cancer stage at diagnosis as the outcome because we can get population-wide data with no selection bias from the Cancer Registry, and also because stage at diagnosis is linked to conditions at time of diagnosis in relation to access to health care as shaped by economic resources, geographic location, and transportation access, with minimal concerns about lag effects. I'll start with some preliminary descriptive results for Boston. Thus, among Boston's current 151 current census tracts included in the areas with Holk designations, 10 or slightly under 7% were in the best categories, green plus blue. Slightly over half were in the yellow or definitely declining, and the remaining 41% were in the hazardous designation or red. Those in the green or blue categories scored high for the racialized ICE for economic segregation, meaning higher extreme concentrations of white, wealthy, non-Hispanic, high-income families. Those in yellow and red scored lower. That is, they had a greater concentration of Black Americans and lower-income households. Census tract poverty rates were likewise lowest in the green plus blue areas, but twice as high in the yellow and red categories. And among women diagnosed with breast cancer, the proportion with regional or distant stage at diagnosis, which is not a good thing, was lowest in the green plus blue census tracts, but fully 10 points higher among those in the yellow and red categories. These patterns suggest that Holt categories are still discriminating, as it were, among both levels of contemporary neighborhood conditions and also the specified health outcomes. These are designations made 80 years ago. In these next slides, I show the results of our expanded analysis of the data for the 28 municipalities in Massachusetts with Holk maps, which I follow with our new New York City preterm birth results. So basically, among the 28 municipalities with the Holk maps, which in 1940 contained 44% of Massachusetts' population and 30% for 2001 to 15, with the time period for the cancer cases we analyzed, there were clear gradients by Holt grade for current census tract conditions as assessed using the census tract poverty level and the 4 different ICE measures. In all cases, census tracts in Holt grade A had the best conditions, those in grade D had the worst conditions, again, a full 80 years after these Holt grades were imposed. We then conducted a series of multi-level, multivariable Poisson regression analyses with individuals nested within census tracts to analyze the associations of cancer stage of diagnosis with both Holt grade and census tract characteristics, taking into account age, gender, race, ethnicity. And we also assembled evidence regarding the mediation of historical redlining effects by contemporary census tract characteristics. We focused on lung, colorectal, breast, and cervical cancer. And we chose these sites because they are major causes of leading mortality in Massachusetts and the US nationally. And all 4 sites exhibit major marked racial, ethnic, and income inequities in stage of diagnosis. And there are also 3 of them are prioritized for cancer screening. This slide shows graphically our key results. We show that for 3 categories of the Holt grades, the standardized proportion of cases with late stage in diagnosis in the best versus worst of the 2 census tract terciles for racialized economic segregation. What stands out is that for breast cancer, for women, and lung cancer, risk of late stage of diagnosis was associated with historical redlining, independently from and also partly mediated by census tract characteristics. Moreover, in our analysis for New York City, where we focus on singleton births in New York City during 2013 to 17, we found that the proportion of preterm births or gestation before 37 weeks ranged from 5% to 5% in the best category A to 7.3% in D, the hazardous. This trend was statistically significant. The odds ratio for preterm births for Holt grade D versus 8 was 1.6 with 95% confidence intervals of 1.4 to 1.7. And so the key points, and I will cut the more details of the analysis, is that once again, Holt grade, even taking into account current census tract characteristics, remains associated with risk of preterm birth. And this raises issues around government accountability and also around intergenerational transmissions of harm. To start wrapping up then, several years ago while in the San Francisco Bay Area, I visited the Muir Woods. There, in the cathedral grove of redwood trees, I learned that in 1945, the delegates who founded the UN that year in San Francisco had come to this very forest. They dedicated a plaque to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one linking a love of the world and a love of peace and humanity, with the hope of an enduring vision and reality that could match the redwoods in their grandeur, longevity, serenity, and capaciousness for fostering life in their niche in the ecosystem. 3 years later, in December 1948, the UN issued the Declaration of Human Rights to give an enduring basis to the rights that we need to thrive. Nearby, there was also the slice of embodied history, a section of a redwood that had fallen down in 1930 and whose birth was traced back to 909 CE. The forms you see here of these standing trees likewise encompass a history of hundreds and hundreds of years, if not millennia. In the pattern, size, and shapes of its branches, and the girth of its trunk, a tree literally wears its history for all to see, such that when we see a tree, we see literally embodied history. And so in closing, we live and die embodied. So does all life on Earth. We are sensuous, conscious, connected, and creative for both good and bad. It is long past time for our sciences to integrate levels and timescales of embodiment from structural policies and structural injustice to submolecular levels across historical generations with an eye towards revealing what it means to embody dignity, equity, and joy. Let us do our work informed by history and a vision premised on social justice, along with deep recognition of our interconnection with and dependence on our wondrous and threatened planet. Thank you. That was a lot, and it was meant to be.
So you have time for a couple questions.
Anyone? Please.
I'll start. I noticed census tract is the theme throughout a lot of your research, and do you ever take it down closer to census block groups? Is that a more accurate measure for those of us working on health at the city level?
So a key thing about census block groups is that they contain a certain amount of socioeconomic data as the census tracts. But there is, especially with the American Community Survey now, much more imprecision at the census block group level. It's pretty bad at the census tract level. It's much worse at the block level. block group level. And so I don't tend to use that. I've done prior research a lot, in fact, when looking at whether it made a difference to use block group versus census tract. And for the kinds of monitoring and research that I've done, it's come out with equivalent results in effect and shown that it's useful. That said, very specific local geographically focused studies should well use all the different relevant information at whatever different geographical levels are available.
Could we maybe take a couple questions at once so that you can hear them? Is that okay? Do you need me to take notes or no?
It's okay.
Well, I was going to ask the purpose and the goal. What do you really expect to happen once we've watched this? Because it's very impactful. A lot of information we've heard. I'm like, wow. So how do we sue the government? You know, what do we
So on the work, so for example, on the work that I'm doing on redlining, I'm doing that in conjunction with urban planners, who are the ones who have the expertise and are working to try to change the policy. They're connected. One of them is a lawyer, and he does actually litigate on these grounds. And part of the question is what the reparations are. And what's happened in the urban planning literature, and this is something familiar to what happened with Sophia talking about human rights years ago, was that there wasn't much health information that was showing what the health impact is. Having the health impact, just as is the case now with climate emergency, bringing the human health impacts into discussions that we're not considering that, adds a whole lot more information, power for advocacy, and people pressing for change. So that's a very quick answer to that one piece of it.
And I was going to say, are you aware that Hackler, the city of Los Angeles, has put some millions into Nickerson Gardens and Jordan Downs, and they're planning to bring in health advocates within those young people that are residents there, teaching them health information, putting the job thing online. You maybe want to connect with them because this is very good information.
Yes, and so to let you know, one thing is tomorrow I'll actually be speaking and giving this presentation to the Los Angeles Department of Public Health. It's precisely to engage with people on exactly those actions. Barbara Ferrer, who's the person in charge there, she used to be at Boston and was in charge of the Boston Public Health Commission. I knew her from back then, and she has a definite focus on racism and health and wants to know this issue.
You have to take a couple questions.
Let me take a couple of questions because so let me hear you, sir. You had your hand up in the back, and then you, and then yeah. So say your questions together, and then I'll respond.
Okay. So real quickly, thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. In terms of spreading information and education about health inequalities, what are some of the obstacles that you think we have? And secondly, quickly, what are some ways that we can incorporate this into medical school education in your perspective?
Sure thing. Okay, let's take another one.
Hi, my name is Adrian. I'm a midwife first. I work for Doctors Without Borders in 22 countries. I'm a Nobel Peace Prize, I have to say that. Yes, we are, 1999. I'm also doing, I work with kids, adolescents, reproductive health.
Okay, and your question is?
The question is, this is very nice, but what can we do for the young generation? Because they are the ones who will be coming to struggle, who will face this struggle. And also we know that 70% of the women, black women, we have a C-section in this country. The mortality rate is high. How can we integrate it? If you hear me, I have an accent. You don't know where I'm from, but I speak 7 languages. When I come to you, somebody can say, hey, you know what? Oh, look at her. They already have this racism toward me without knowing that I'm smart. Meaning, how can we learn and teach each and every one of us?
Right. So, okay, there was one more hand up. Let me take your questions. I really appreciate them, and they speak to the urgency of how one uses these kinds of data to make change.
I work in the space of modern slavery and in complex supply chains, and I'm curious, in all your research, if you found heavy health correlations in sort of a slave labor environment. I see a lot of it is U.S. based, and I'm wondering how much is global and how much is...
So that I can say, I personally am not, I am aware of some research, but I can say that. So let me speak to the first two. So I think part of the value of presenting these kinds of data is in part to educate people that are actually in health about these histories and about these embodied histories. Because there is such a profound, deep legacy of scientific racism in this country. and biological essentialism more broadly writ, that one has to prevent evidence that actually counters that. That's actually part of the work of changing people's understanding and having data to show what the impacts are, and also not only the impacts, but the possibilities for change. Know what we showed about the convergence of birth rates with the abolition, infant death rates with the abolition of Jim Crow. Know what we showed with the change in breast cancer estrogen receptor status among the young women diagnosed under age 55. This is mutable, meaning it's changeable, meaning these are not fixed, this is not permanent. And you actually need to have data that show that. So there's a piece which is me, the work of a social epidemiologist, conversing and engaging with people that are doing social justice work in many different fora, finding out what the gaps are and the knowledge and data needed to help drive the agendas. That's true also for Black infant mortality and Black maternal mortality. How do you show how it varies, how it changes? How do you bring in, for example, the economic determinants, but also the segregation determinants? Because that's really important, because as many of you have seen in endless debates in this country, people go, it's racism or class. They don't think about these things together. To have research that doesn't bring together what racialized economic segregation is, there's nothing wrong with people people in inclusive ways living together. There are problems when you have people being constrained to live in places that were underinvested, disinvested because of actions, and particularly by the US government. And the question of reparations and fair housing also gets new purchase by virtue of these kinds of analyses. So I think that it's this kind of thing of you don't generate these data in a vacuum, and they are geared to the medical education. For example, with another hat, I am also chair of the Spirit of 1848 caucus in the American Public Health Association. We focus on issues of social justice and public health. One of our three foci has always been progressive pedagogy. The others are politics of public health data and also social history of public health. And the last several years in our progressive pedagogy session, we've had people talking about the classes that they're creating in medical schools as well as in public health schools to bring this kind of education and transform things. So you can go to our website, Spirit of 1848, just look it up on the web, and you can look at the APHA activities that we have, and you can look at our report backs, and it gives the summary of every presentation. You can see the contact information for the people who have been designing these courses, and you can find out who else there is and network with them to find out how they did or didn't get their courses changed in terms of public health schools as well as medical schools. So I think to me what's very heartening, and back to the young people, is I'm actually really heartened by the way that the younger generations, particularly in the public health schools, when everything was going on with Ferguson and the police killings and really pushing on that, to start to challenge the problems that were happening curricular. Sure, I as a faculty member may cover these kinds of things. How do we get this to be required and covered in many more courses to train the people that will be going out to engage and try to make a difference with public health as a concern?
And with that, would you all join me in thanking Anna?